to help us understand how mobility helps Filipino communities adapt to both climate emergencies and slow onset climate change, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Maureen De La Cruz, National IOM Project Officer for the Climate Change Adaptation and Community Resilience in the Philippines, or CARP program. In addition to her career in development and the humanitarian sector, Maureen is also a human rights lawyer. Her field work has given her the opportunity to be deeply involved with communities who feel the cutting impact of the climate crisis. So this issue is quite personal to her. And as a little bit of trivia for all of you, Maureen was also once upon a time a media practitioner. She hasn't completely left behind the writing. She continues to publish creative writing pieces occasionally, and so is used to and very familiar with telling stories about climate from a storytelling lens. Maureen will give us an overview of climate change adaptation and its linkages to mobility. Hi, Maureen.
Hi, thank you so much, Anna, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, even amid ongoing emergencies. Um, so I hope everyone's safe during the earthquake. But to take off from our discussions on day one, last Monday, and also to frame the presentations of our other speakers. So 2 days ago, we focused on the linkages between migration or human mobility, population movements in general, and climate change. We had a chance to clarify why are we talking about these two issues or these two thematic areas in relation to each other, when usually in the global discourse and in policy approaches they're still seen separately, but in fact, as we've seen, mobility is a key dimension of both the effects of climate change and also one of the possible ways that people cope with challenges linked to the shifting climate. So, my talk today will focus on human mobility as an adaptation and resilience strategy in the face of climate change. So let's look at the first slide. We asked a similar question at the start of this discussion, when we talk about climate change or induced disasters, what comes to mind? Um, and now, let's take a chance to reflect on how are Filipinos adapting to climate change. We flashed on the screen two photos from our recent field visits from the 11 project areas that we are covering under this current project, the Climate Change Adaptation and Community Resilience Project in the Philippines, or CARP. Um, and these are from very diverse communities. So I'd like to ask, I'm sure our participants today are based in or are originally from different areas of the Philippines. And we also have even some international colleagues and friends joining us today. Um, who would like to take a guess? Where is the first photo from? The one on the left-hand side. Would anyone have any idea where this community is? Are we seeing anyone and any responses on chat? Tacloban, is Dr. Laris is saying Tacloban. How about the one on the right? I think we see some similarities where we have houses on stilts in both locations. So what about the right hand one? Would anyone have a guess? Okay, so this may surprise you, and I chose these two photos to highlight the extent of yeah, okay, two are guessing Bulacan. It seems that some of our participants are quite familiar with the lay of the land, so to speak, in some of the climate affected areas. So actually, the second one, the right hand one, is correct. Bulacan. Um, Although in fact, maybe even some of our Metro Manila based colleagues on the call would be surprised that you find communities like this in in a location in Luzon, very near to Metro Manila. But the left hand one is actually in Bonggao, Tawi-Tawi. There's a Bajau community that was recently affected by Typhoon Paeng. So many of the houses and stills were actually completely washed out, and they're still in the process of rebuilding. So you actually see that part of the boardwalk there connecting these houses and stilts were patched up by just thin bamboo sticks, because the wooden bridges connecting the houses um, were washed away in some places. So this just brings home to us how basically so many communities in the Philippines are coping with the realities of the climate crisis on a daily basis. And whether you're in Luzon, Visayas, or Mindanao, whether you're in the city or in a remote rural area, actually, um, the climate crisis is of global scope and has a wide-ranging effect on us at individual, at household, and at community level, and presents a major challenge to us as a country. So if we can move to the next slide. Again, just to introduce some key concepts as we did in day one, for us to have a common understanding of what are we talking about in the first place when we use terms like climate change, when we talk about concepts like climate resilience. So referring back to the UNFCCC, um, when we say climate change, it's usually understood as by the term itself, a change in climate, which is attributed to human activity. So directly or indirectly caused by human activity. And it alters the composition of the global atmosphere. And it's beyond or in addition to your natural variation of climate that would be normally observed over comparable time periods. So uh, it's correlatable really to human activity. Um, and resilience has become sort of a buzzword for us Filipinos. It's often used in these conversations. Um, and essentially what we mean and we'll be talking a lot today about capacities, about risk management. So for those of us who are working maybe in government or in NGOs implementing development projects, these are things that we are also concerned with on a day-to-day basis. So climate resilience, as used in a recent report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group, is the capacity of human or ecological systems, social, economic, and ecosystems to cope with a hazardous event or a trend or disturbance. So, on the one hand, you have the phenomenon of climate change as part of the range of environmental phenomena that are linked to the impacts of human activity on the environment. And on the other hand, you have resilience as the capability to cope or to respond to these changes. So next slide. What does the global response currently look like? As you have probably heard, the Conference of Parties just concluded in this November, this last month, and basically the two pillars in global responses to the climate crisis are adaptation and mitigation. And these are probably by now, I remember when I was first working in this thematic area more than a decade ago, maybe ordinary Filipinos would not be too familiar with these terms. There were still new concepts at the time. But I think at the very least, the consciousness has advanced to the point where um, even those of us who are not necessarily in full-time environmental advocacy have heard terms like adaptation and mitigation being used. So adaptation is basically that basically refers to adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems. So changes in processes or structures to mitigate, rather to moderate the potential damage or even to benefit from opportunities associated with climate change. In short, tayo yung nag-a-adjust. The change is there, and we are implementing our own adjustments to be able to cope. On the other hand, mitigation, there's a more scientific aspect to it. That we often probably hear about greenhouse gas emissions being discussed. So that's usually the focus. Mitigation it primarily covers efforts to prevent or reduce emission of greenhouse gases, which contributes to the global warming phenomenon and climate change in general. So, for example, this can take the form of using renewable energy, um, modifying older equipment to make them more energy efficient, or the response of businesses to change their management practices, or also to modify consumer behavior. Um, so this represents us a spectrum of responses, and both are important. But today we're talking about primarily the adaptation side, and more specifically the importance of mobility in climate change adaptation. So next slide. Um, in our recent research on this topic, so IOM Philippines published a report last 2021 entitled "Framing the Human Narratives of the Climate Crisis." So it really looked at um, the faces behind the data. How is the climate crisis impacting Filipinos, and who are the sectors who are most vulnerable to those impacts? So we're actually seeing both voluntary and involuntary adaptive strategies. So voluntary strategies may include community organizing, a permanent or circular migration, and there are also involuntary strategies observed, such as distress migration or emergency evacuation, and in some cases, systemic relocation. So next slide. Um, Essentially, since we're talking about adapting to the challenges that the climate crisis brings, I always like to refer back to something that is a key concept for us in humanitarian assistance. So in humanitarian protection, um, we often refer to the risk equation. Essentially, you have threats, and there's a level of vulnerability of an individual or a population group to that threat. And those factors are balanced out by the capacities of that individual or that group or that community to cope with that threat. So, in order to mitigate the risk, to manage the risk, you either try to uh, remove or eliminate the threat, or to somehow reduce its presence, its proximity to those affected, or address the factors that increase vulnerability, or you increase the capacities in order to better manage the risks. So this is one lens through which we can look at adaptation. Um, Essentially, it works on usually either the vulnerability side, by sort of balancing out the factors that make someone or a place, a community, more vulnerable to climate change impacts, or you provide interventions that can actually boost their capacities. So yeah, let's have the next slide. Um, I'd like to draw a particular lens here to basically multi-factor vulnerabilities. Since vulnerability and resilience, these are big words, but they can be analyzed at various levels, at country, community, household, or individual level. So cross-cutting factors usually contribute to vulnerability in the context of environmental migration. So I'm going to refer to gender as an example, although it's definitely not the only factor. Um, but I'm bringing this into the discussion essentially just to highlight how complex these issues usually are, and uh, nuanced, how multi-layered responses also actually have to be. Because to have effective adaptation strategies, you would usually need to look at these different layers of vulnerability at those levels, whether you're supporting an entire community or one particular individual or a family. So, for example, in relation to gender, and its impact on vulnerability to environmental changes, and on the possibility of tapping mobility as a means of coping. There may be cultural constraints on the migration of women. Often, women have a central role, childcare roles in the family, for instance, but at the same time, there may be higher demand for female labor in destination areas. So the reality is that, and we know this, I'm sure many of us who know families with OFWs among their family members have observed that in some cases it's the mothers or it's the female household members who migrate for work, um, because the available opportunities in destination countries or within the country, let's say in urban areas, focus on the care sector, for instance. So at the same time, temporary migration by male heads of household may result in increased vulnerabilities for women staying behind. So that may be one factor driving the decision to choose that it would be the man, the male head of household who would migrate. If labor migration is decided upon by the family as a coping mechanism. And yet, of course, there's also a flip side. So we're talking about vulnerabilities from a holistic lens. Migration can also increase the vulnerability of men who were separated from their families as labor migrants. So they are far away from their loved ones. They are exposed often to hazardous conditions of work overseas, and at the same time their wives or their spouses and their children may also be dealing with other vulnerabilities while staying behind in their homes. So it's gender definitely uh, comes into the equation when we talk about vulnerabilities. So it's on all sides, and of course we can also think about other cross-cutting factors when we look at, for example, segments of the population for whom gender is also a prime entry point for vulnerability. So if we talk about LGBT migrants, for instance, or gender non-conforming migrants, then they're also exposed to other risks. So cultural factors linked to gender, such as unequal access to education or information, can also play a role. Um, so we do observe that in many communities that are affected by natural disasters, there can be higher risks of trafficking in persons, for instance. Families in evacuation centers may be more vulnerable to illegal recruiters operating within the community. And because families are facing economic challenges because of their displacement due to a disaster, then they may be more susceptible to being trafficked in order to in order to access a job, to earn income for the family and find a way to deal with the economic impact of being displaced after a typhoon, after a flood, etc. So next slide, please. Okay, so it's important to recognize that both climatic and non-climatic environmental changes can trigger migration. So again, especially for those who were unable to join day one, you've probably noticed that we're using the word migration in a broader sense. So it can cover um, forced displacement or voluntary population movements, and we are also trying to look at the linkages between, for example, what we usually see as a voluntary choice to migrate, such as labor migration, and yet in many cases, if you probe deeper, the impacts of um, climate changes may have been among the many drivers, may have been one of the factors that led to that decision. So, both climatic changes such as temperature rise, reduced precipitation, sea level rise, etc., and non-climatic changes that in some cases are less observed or less not necessarily that they don't happen as often, but maybe they are less noticeable to some of the communities affected, such as land degradation, coastal and aquatic ecosystem degradation. Most of this can actually trigger migration. So as highlighted in Anna's introduction, maybe what we usually see, what catches our attention are usually the sudden onset emergencies, um, the immediate aftermath of those disasters. So that's when we really wake up to the reality that climate change is happening before our very eyes. But at the same time, there are also slow onset events that may have escaped our attention, may even be invisible from a policy lens, from a decision making lens, and yet over time they affect livelihoods, ways of life, community stability, and can thus drive population movements. So, next slide, please. Globally, there are various forms of mobility that are observed in response to environmental changes. We're seeing both rural to rural, for example. In the Philippines, we do have a lot of internal migrants. And in fact, we hardly have any data on this. People who move from province to province or who migrate seasonally when it's harvest season. Some people in the provinces do also move to other places in order to find temporary work and then return to their communities of origin once that job is done. Of course, we're seeing a lot of rural to urban migration in the Philippines, and globally, this is also observed. And is expected to continue. In day one, we presented an overview of global environmental migration trends, and it's projected that in the year 2050, by the year 2050 rather, we'd have even more environmental migrants. So we'd have something like 21.6 million, if I remember correctly, environmental migrants globally if current trends continue. So that's the projection. And of course, both rural and urban areas, we are seeing movement outside borders, outside territorial boundaries. So international migration is also one response to climate challenges. And as mentioned, from short to long term, we are seeing all of these already happening, and we may expect that they would most likely continue. So among Filipinos, seasonal, temporary, and permanent migration alike actually happens. And some of it is driven by environmental factors, cross-cutting with many other factors that play a role in their vulnerability as an individual, as a family, or as a community. So usually migration decisions are complex and multi-layered. Um, but again, the directly felt impact, the lived experience of Filipinos in coping with the daily effects of climate change could definitely already be playing a role, and we just need um, more research to actually surface all of these patterns. So that's part of what our project is actually doing. Um, Mapping out migration experiences of people in vulnerable communities, in communities that have been affected by displacement or have experienced multiple disasters. And it's actually emerging that many of them have moved from within the same barangay, from one barangay to another province, or some have even worked as OFWs and have returned again to be with their families throughout their lifetimes. And um, cross-cutting all of these, uh, y- you would often hear the pattern that this partly because their livelihoods weren't stable enough to support themselves and their families, and one reason for that is that their home communities were affected by disasters. So next slide, please. So what do mobility focused adaptation strategies look like? Um, it can take the form of one, minimizing forced migration. So usually if we bring mobility into the discussion as an adaptation strategy, we try to look at solutions for people to stay first. If in situ adaptation is possible, then communities should be able to access support that could enable them to stay. So this can take the form of enhancing livelihoods, extending access to social protection mechanisms such as insurance or financial aid, or income opportunities within their own home communities, or implementing disaster risk reduction measures in those areas. Uh, in some cases, even if evacuation is often resorted to as an emergency measure, the reality is that sometimes populations are trapped. So can adaptation strategies can also encompass providing emergency assistance to those trapped populations, those who are unable to leave, whether on a temporary basis, or those who have at the moment nowhere else to move to, or would lose their livelihoods and their traditional ways of life, or their support networks if they were to move to another place, and therefore are constrained to stay even in areas where they are at risk. So and lastly, facilitating migration as adaptation, for example, planned relocation, or facilitating, for example, labor migration internally or internationally, can be part of adaptation strategies. So, what would these look like? Can have skills training and access to education. Can also include facilitating internal or border mobility, and facilitating remittances, efficient sending of remittances by labor migrants to their families and their home communities. So in our recent field visits, we're actually seeing a lot of solutions, usually community initiated solutions that often have a mobility dimension. So just some of the forms that Filipino resourcefulness and ingenuity have manifested themselves. For example, in transportation design, um, this is something that I also mentioned last Monday, since it has already caught the attention of international media. The Guardian ran a story about this. So we were able to, okay, it's not the lower part of the tricycle is not seen very clearly on screen right now, but this is actually an elevated tricycle that we saw in Hagonoy, Bulacan. They've modified the traditional design of your staple Filipino tricycle. to raise it above the waters and still be able to run to transport passengers even while the streets are still flooded. Um, and next slide. In some cases, it can also be an infrastructure solution. So just yesterday, we were in Navota City. I think many of us are familiar with it as a frequently flood-prone area. And they're in the process of constructing dikes um, across their coastline. Actually, they have both riverside areas and coastal seaside areas, and these cover several barangays. I think majority of the land area of the city is actually beside bodies of water. So this one that's under construction, there is an opening there that would allow boats, the fishing boats of the residents. The community beside this is actually an informal fishing community. They're a community of informal settlers um, in Barangay Tangos, Navota City, and they make their living through fishing. So the gate would be able to close at high tide so that the rising waters from the river or from the seaside or from the ocean um would not be able to get in, but the boats can still dock safely, so it can be opened and closed just to admit the boats and then be closed in order to protect the community from sea level rise during high tide. So these are just some examples when it comes to the range of solutions that are possible and that are actually being implemented either by communities themselves or led by their local governments and supported by other partners. So many of these communities actually development partners, NGOs are also actively providing assistance to residents of the affected areas. Um, there is a slide here that I included to highlight the role of remittances. So we'd like to clarify that we're not saying that um, labor migration in particular, or even just voluntary migration, is a catch-all solution for all communities. Um, at best, we know that it's a band-aid solution, and we are also aware that thousands of OFWs actually returned during the pandemic. The companies employing them closed down. They were laid off. Their contracts ended, and they ended up having to go back to the Philippines, and in many cases, struggling to make a living upon return. So reintegration has also always been a key challenge for returning migrants. And basically, if reintegration responses are not effectively implemented, then it just becomes a repeating cycle. The savings that were actually the product of the hard work of our OFWs do not translate into investments, into sustainable businesses, for example, for themselves and their families. And they find themselves looking to remigrate or still looking for job opportunities locally months or years after their return. Um, so what we'd like to emphasize here is that remittances can actually be a potential tool to support adaptation measures. So labor migration often being a response for a coping mechanism for families struggling with climate challenges. Um, Traditionally, the remittances sent home serve as financial support to family members. They serve to fund all of the expenses of the household. Hopefully, some of it also goes into investments at household level. Some of it would also be channeled towards savings for the future. And this is why access to financial literacy programs, financial planning education is also very crucial, not only for the OFWs themselves, but for their families. So you have essential conditions to make this possible in the first place. But the potential role of investments, and given that as a percentage of our country's GDP, we usually have from year to year at least 10%, if not more, um, being constituted by the remittances that OFWs actually send home. Um, what the opportunity that we may be missing is for these investments, for all the hard work of Filipinos who go abroad, to actually be channeled towards resilience measures. Uh, so, in fact, you seeing remittances this way as means towards poverty reduction and increased resilience actually multiplies their impact and basically gives us even more compelling reasons to engage our diasporas. So if they can be translated into, even at community level, collective infrastructure investments, risk reduction projects, or even individual OFWs who are able to set up businesses, who save up capital and are able to leverage financial mechanisms to set up businesses. And if those businesses implement small scale adaptation measures, then that contributes towards the overall capacities of a community. But there are necessary conditions for that to happen. Government support is much needed. Um, Access to the financial mechanisms that make sending remittances possible and easy and safe for labor migrants need to be in place. And obviously you cannot rely on just remittances. How do vulnerable municipalities, for example, LGUs in far-flung communities, access climate funds or official development assistance? But we know that in reality, um, the money being sent home is often even more than ODA, and reaches families in need more quickly than any development aid. So what this brings home for us is really a need to look at all of these dynamics more holistically and connect the individual and family level responses uh, to the macro level needs. Because even at a personal level, even in terms of specific households, we are seeing that the earnings of OFWs, as we said, they are not always made sustainable, but we are also seeing examples of best practices. So, for example, in shelter projects that were implemented by IOM Philippines in the wake of Typhoon Ulysses, um, the model, the design of the shelter units that were built in Surigao and the Dinagat Islands were actually patterned after the houses that were built by OFWs who used their savings to build more climate resilient shelters. So it was actually known in the communities that the houses of OFWs in those areas were sturdier because they were able to invest in more climate resilient materials, and they wanted to channel those savings into something more durable to protect their families from the impacts of natural disasters. So, and we have to remember that remittances are not just in the form of financial remittances. Social remittances are one very undertapped aspect of labor migration in the Philippines. Returning OFWs bring home new skills and knowledge that can actually contribute to overall resilience of their communities and of the country as a whole. And right now, perhaps we're only starting to explore the potential of that, to really see how those investments could be better leveraged in order to support our country's resilience as a whole. Because otherwise, we would just have returning migrants who would, upon their return, have a job mismatch if they try to find employment again, or who try to set up businesses but are struggle to access means to support their entrepreneurial aspirations. Um, Next slide, please. So, in short, I guess the key message that I'd like to bring home here is that there is no one size fits all solution. So we've stressed that mobility can be a key aspect of adaptation strategies, but those strategies can take many forms. And it's usually the communities who actually live these realities daily, um, who know what works for them, what is most effective. After all, climate change is a global issue. Solutions are implemented locally, but also it demands global action, and those local solutions contribute towards global impacts. Uh, Now, as a country, we are in a position of balancing that with our specific vulnerabilities and challenges on the ground. In Tawi-Tawi, for example, we had a conversation with the LGU where they were talking about how they were trying to step up um, their their community resilience and adaptation measures. Um, we actually saw in action, yeah, projects like recycling, waste segregations, and they identified waste management as a key challenge. But we're seeing a small town like Bonggao, Tawi-Tawi, um, trying to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And this is not a city. You don't have large buildings. You don't have heavy industries located in the city, and yet they were trying to do what they could, to the point where they even considered prohibiting welding operations. But then they realized that that would mean that it would deprive the welders of their livelihoods. So essentially, as a country, we're faced with those challenges. We deal with that, and this is a global conversation where we are all trying to do our part. If a coastal community like Bonggao can be pushed to that point, then obviously this calls on all of us at a global level to take action. Obviously, the end goal of this is what we usually call sustainable development. As early as 1987, the United Nations already drew attention to the urgency of this issue, that it actually affects our very existence. We only have one planet to live in, so the development that we aspire for needs to be able to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It really has an intergenerational impact across time. And while we are one of the our communities, our vulnerable sectors are the ones who are most heavily affected, we are actually faced we are in the throes of a global climate crisis. So again, local solutions can do their part. We see communities adapting as best as they can, including through mobility. But all of those efforts need to come together and be part of a global concerted um, movement in order to actually make an impact on the ground. Thank you so much, and looking forward to answering your questions after our other speakers.
Thank you, Maureen, for giving us that overview of what slow onset climate change is, and also the role of migration in adapting to slow onset climate change. You were talking about how both climatic and not climatic, climatic, I hope I got that right. Changes impact mobility on a seasonal, temporary, and permanent level. And since we are talking about migration, we're widening that lens to talk about, yes, how remittances can help communities build more climate resilient infrastructure programs, like in the case of Bongawi, Tawi-Tawi. But also you talked about solutions for making people stay, because not everyone will have a capacity or even the motivation or desire to move. And that also has to be part of the conversation of coping mechanisms when it comes to dealing with the climate crisis.